Hey there, Colin Marshall, host of the Marketplace of Ideas here, letting you know that if you have any feedback on the program, positivities, negativities, questions, comments, guest suggestions, or anything else, feel free to email it straight to colin@colinmarshallradio.com. That address again is colin@colinmarshallradio.com. This week on the Marketplace of Ideas, a conversation with sound artist Lawrence English about his new seasonally themed album, A Color for Autumn. Lawrence English is a composer, multimedia artist, critic, and head of the Brisbane-based record imprint and arts organization Room 40. His new release, A Color for Autumn, was called a powerful example of the evocative possibilities of minimalist sound art by Rave Magazine. Lawrence, welcome to the program.
Good to be here, Colin. Thanks for having me.
This album, A Color for Autumn, it follows up your earlier album, For Varying Degrees of Winter, which appear to be the first two chapters in a larger, a wider, seasonally themed project. What's going on here? What is this project?
Well, look, I thought I'd challenge Vivaldi. You know, he seems to have the kind of the stakes, the digs, if you like, on this particular area. So I thought, look, it's about time someone else put in a stake on the claim, and basically I started working on this project, which is, ironically enough, a four record project focusing on each season as, I guess, a thematic jumping point. I guess what's about the work particularly is, I suppose, a little bit different rather than the Vivaldi approach, which was, I guess, reflecting on the human to some degree anyway. I'm very much interested in the environment and the shifting changes of the environment. So whether that be oral things like, the way that different kinds of insects are more prevalent at certain times of the year in different countries, whether that be foliage or whether it be the kind of cultural understandings that we have attached to those seasons. So when I did the winter one, for example, I travelled a lot through Europe, and being here in the Southern Hemisphere, we still have this idea of Christmas should be a white Christmas, whereas for us it's actually like usually 35 degrees and incredibly humid and quite warm, and people still make hot dinners, I guess, as a sort of reflection on that idea that somewhere else in the world it's snowing and it's, a white Christmas.
And that's, of course, 35 degrees Celsius for the listeners here in America.
That's right. Of course, if it was 35 degrees Fahrenheit, there'd be something wrong down here.
How much does this idea of wanting to build recordings on the season stem from your interest, which you've acknowledged in many interviews before this one, in field recording?
I guess it partly comes out of that. I'm certainly interested in the way that environments change in terms of the way that they reflect sound or the way that they envelope sound in some way. I had a friend who does a lot of work in the Austrian Alps, and he said one of the most amazing things was at that end of winter where you start, I guess, the snow's fallen, it's all settled. He said you can walk outside this cabin, and if there's a bee maybe 50 meters away from you can hear it very clearly because it's the only thing in the sound space. And I've had a few experiences like that traveling in different places, whether it be very extreme kinds of sounds like, for instance, in parts of Japan and summer you have this amazing sizzling cicada kind of chorus. And even here in Australia, I'm consistently struck by very differing kinds of sonic environments that are to do with seasonal change.
And so we won't really know, listeners in America, where most of the listeners from this program will hear it, especially on the terrestrial broadcast, but listeners in America aren't going to know, actually anybody out of Australia won't know what an Australian autumn is like. Could you maybe describe what are the unique qualities of autumn in Australia?
Okay. I think it is very different to the Northern Hemisphere idea of autumn. We don't have as many deciduous trees as you do there in the States and in countries like Japan. So for us, an autumn is kind of like, I guess the easiest way to describe it is you'll know it's autumn when there comes to be two things. There's a sort of wind, ironically, I guess the wind of change, and then there's this kind of beautiful stillness in the morning. So unfortunately, the last few mornings I've been awake at about 4 o'clock in the morning. But I've walked outside, and it's one of these magical times where everything is completely still. There's this kind of crispness in the air. It's not cold, but it's crisp, and there's a kind of a sort of lilting quality to the landscape. It just sort of it's very soft, focused, but still quite sharp around the edges. You can make everything out. And I think one of the things about autumn here is it's very transitional, but it's very subtle. It's not a radical change. There's not suddenly lots of trees that are in a different color or anything like that. Things sometimes get a little bit quieter, and you can kind of hear more detail if you're sort of listening. And if you're looking around, we have these beautiful kind of quite clear blue, crisp mornings where the sky actually looks a different kind of shade of blue. So it's a very kind of transitional thing here, but it's very subtle. It's not radical at all. And I think that's something I certainly tried to capture in some of the pieces from the record.
Now, when you're recording these albums, when you're composing this autumn album or the winter album, what is the balance between actually using literally the environmental sounds of that time of the year and then invoking the qualities like the ones you've mentioned, invoking the subtlety of autumn in the morning in Australia or any of the other more abstract sorts of things that the season brings with it?
Sure. I mean, for me, I do try to use, if I'm using field recordings that are in some ways reflective of places or spaces that I've been, I do try to use those from the periods that I've recorded them in. So ideally, a lot of the ideas and the influences and inspirations for autumn for this record did certainly come out of being in autumn in different places. So, for example, the first piece, Droplet, has a recording from Marseille, basically, and there's this amazing wind there called the Mistral, and I was there just at the beginning of, I suppose, the more serious end of autumn where it was starting to get cold, and I made this amazing recording there of the Mistral basically passing off the ocean into the city, and it was something that really struck me as again this kind of change. You get the idea of the wind of change. I tried to kind of, I guess, with a lot of the pieces, find either recordings, if I was using field recordings in the pieces, that reflected very directly on those things. But sometimes as well, I find that a field recording is kind of like a Polaroid photo. You make it while you're somewhere, and it acts as a trigger point for memory. So on the winter album, for example, I was in Spain for winter once and visited Valencia, and there was this amazing art museum there that has a huge almost like small ocean, a big swimming pool out the front of the art centre. And it started raining, and there was this amazing sound of the rain reflecting off the surface of the water. And I made a kind of very rough recording of it. And when I got back to the studio, I tried to emulate some of the qualities of that in one of the pieces from the For Varying Degrees of Winter album. So it works both ways, sometimes in a very literal way for me working with field recordings, but then also as a memory or trigger point or some kind of compositional guide, if you like.
Having used field recordings, having been searching them out and employing them in your compositions since the 1990s, how sensitive are you to the stuff when you're just walking around? You must be picking it up all the time.
Yeah, quite often. I mean, that's the kind of beauty of something like field recording, is that if you listen in any environment, I think you'll find interesting things. I was just part of a project here in Australia called the Ideas Festival, which is kind of like a think tank, I guess you'd say, for different ways of approaching obviously ideas, but also themes and issues that sort of people engage with all the time. And I was on a panel to do with the idea of partly creative conservation, but also this idea of listening, because obviously, more and more we have these very big urban centres. We're seeing most people in the next, 10 or 15 years will be living in urban centres. So it's compact living. People are very close together, which traditionally hasn't happened as much. And obviously there's a lot more noise, in inverted commas, noise pollution and concerns about sound in the urban environment. And one of the things that we were talking about was the fact that wherever you are, all the time, where you are right now, where I am, there's background sound going on, and we can either choose to treat it as an interference, a noise, a kind of element of confusion, if you like, or we can actually open our ears up to it, listen to it, and see what are the qualities in those sounds. So, for example, here in Australia, we have a lot of people complaining about road noise, basically. And I said to people, and plane noise, they're the two kind of big concerns, which I think is the same in a lot of urban centres. And I said to people, have you actually ever listened to those sounds? And we took a minute at this conference to listen to some of the sounds that were going on. We were in sort of an open air area. And it was interesting to watch people actually begin to realise that these are sounds that they probably never listened to. And I think, by contrast to some of the sounds that people like to have, like birds in the morning, those kinds of things, they're actually quite strong, sharp sounds as well. And I think we place a hierarchy on the kinds of listening that we do. So for me, when I'm walking around, I do try to have an open ear, because you never really know what is it, what are the qualities of these sounds that we're going to come across. Every single country sounds different. When you cross a street in Japan, the sound that allows you to cross the street is different to the one in Australia. It's different to the one in the UK. There are all these little subtleties, all these incidental differences that are kind of a wealth of inspiration in a way for someone like me, but also a curiosity, I think, for other people. And it's good to be open to that.
I assume this is a theme you do have to expound on to friends you meet who are not already sound artists, who don't already listen, who aren't attuned to the non-musical sounds around them. I take it you've often had to explain, this really can be something you can engage with artistically if you want to.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. I definitely have come across people that, I guess quite confused by the interest. But I think what's interesting is once people take the time to listen, they have, whether it's a small or a large revelation, that there is this quite curious world out there. I mean, I've been very fortunate making some recordings for a record I did last year called Studies for Stradbroke, which was all these field recordings from an island quite close to where I live called Stradbroke Island. And I was there. It's a very kind of normal neighbourhood, quite a beautiful place. And I was there making these field recordings of dolphins and prawns, basically, off this pier. And the number of people I had come up and asked to put the headphones on while I was recording was extraordinary. I basically had to stop the recording, pass it over, everyone has a listen. Wow, that's what a dolphin sounds like. Isn't that amazing? And then you kind of have a conversation about the way that dolphins use sound underwater. And people are curious. And I believe very strongly in terms of music and all kinds of listening, people are hungry for something new and different and exciting. And I think that's something that certainly fueled my interest in presenting new sound work in Australia as much as creating my own work. I'm very interested to expose people to new sounds and to encourage people to listen, because it is one of those simple pleasures. Our ears are an underutilized sense. We live in such a visual culture that to have that chance to listen every once in a while is something that we need to treasure and value.
Now, that particular album you mentioned, Studies for Stradbroke, that was entirely field recordings, correct? All you were doing was essentially EQ changing.
Yeah, almost no EQ changing, in fact. It was really? Very, very straightforward. Basically, what I tried to do was set up situations or find interesting situations that I could record that in some ways captured sounds that would otherwise be impossible for us to hear. So I made recordings with these beautiful hydrophones, and what I did in some cases was to insert them into the sand just on the edge of where a lake was, so when the lake lapped onto the shore, the water being sucked back down through the sand would be amplified through the hydrophone. So very simple things like that that would otherwise be inaudible to our ears.
We should explain that a hydrophone is, correct me if I'm wrong, a microphone that can go in the water.
Yes, it's an underwater microphone, yeah.
How recent is that technology, by the way? Is that a new thing?
It's not really. I mean, it's interesting, the whole nature of what we're doing right now, and radio and sound being exchanged. I mean, it's not a very new concept at all, really. This is one of the reasons I think sound is still undervalued or underutilized, is we've only really been able to record and reproduce sound for about 130 years, give or take. To do it in the home has only really been about 50 or 60 years when magnetic tape was introduced. Before that, it was a very commercial enterprise getting things recorded and reproducing things like voice. So it's a very, very short history, whereas you look at visual arts, there are tens of thousands of years of history, or thousands of years of painting and, now photography and moving image. With sound, it's still very, very young. And with sound art particularly, it's an incredibly young history. You look back to the 20th century and your characters like Walter Ruttmann, who made one of the first sort of collages in Berlin, through to John Cage and that whole school of people there. I mean, they're recent figures. And this discussion about sound is, I think, only beginning to come to the surface now. You've seen a lot of books, for instance, published in the last few years, and I know there are some fantastic new books on the way.
It does seem to me, and tell me if it seems the same way to you, that the technology for manipulating sound today is so advanced. I mean, what we're doing right now it's almost miraculous if you step back even from the perspective of 10 years. We're recording essentially a phone conversation over the internet with high-quality sound. You're you're in Australia, I'm in the States. This is completely synchronous and it's great, but the technology for recording, manipulating, and conveying sound, for disseminating sound, it seems like is actually, or it's ahead of what people are actually doing with it. People are somewhat behind in employing this creatively. Would you agree or disagree with that?
Yeah, I think there are people using sound in really interesting ways, and I think there's some interesting questions about how we choose to use sound. But it's true, the nature of handheld recording devices, for example, is completely incredible. I just spent a few weeks in the Amazon last year making field recordings in the middle of the jungle, the middle of nowhere, and to be able to do that easily and I made 70 hours worth of recordings. That is an extraordinary archive of material. But to think that, only 45, 50 years ago, for people to do that was such a massive undertaking. They had to carry these large cassette recorders, and the kind of microphone technology was usually mono, and it had a certain frequency bandwidth that it could actually capture. Today we have such a huge possibility, which is fantastic. But at the same time, I find it quite interesting because we don't necessarily hear that many new sounds in music, particularly. For me, I don't draw a distinction between sound and music. They're both the same kind of activity. Listening to a plane taking off is equally as enjoyable for me as listening to a great pop song. They both got particular qualities that you can sort of enjoy. But what interests me is you don't necessarily hear that much new sound in music. For instance, I often ask people, when was the last time you heard a new sound, a sound you hadn't heard before in a song or a piece of music? And I think for myself, there are a few records in the last 10 years maybe that I've heard where I was surprised by the character of a sound. Like there was the first Daft Punk record, Defunk, had a fantastic kind of filter, very rubbery, sound like someone playing a balloon, sound on a filter. That was the first time I'd heard that, and that actually made me really excited because it sounded so alien and unfamiliar. And there was another artist called Florian Hecker, a Viennese guy who works with synthesis techniques to create unusual sounds, and he had this record called Sun Pandemonium that was so completely alien. It was very exciting to listen to. But I think often you find with a lot of music, it's a curious situation that we're not hearing differing relationships or different sounds that are quite foreign. I think considering what's possible, we should potentially have more of that going on. So I think in terms of what you're saying about people not exploiting the technology to its maximum potential, maybe that's true. But I guess there's an inherent challenge there, because to have people listening and enjoying that, there needs to be something there for them to get a hold of as well as kind of be challenged by.
To go back to what you were saying about how in the new album, A Color for Autumn, field recordings are used, you mentioned the opening track, Droplet. So we're going to hear that now. Here's Droplet from Lawrence English's newest release, A Color for Autumn. That was Droplet from A Color for Autumn, new from Lawrence English. So how did field recordings get used in that track? What did you do with them to work them into the overall texture of the piece?
I guess for that piece in particular, I was quite interested in the physicalness of the experience that I'd had in Marseille with this wind there called the Mistral, which is their wind that kind of comes through as autumn rolls in. Very strong physical wind. And we were at this place called Notre Dame de la Garde, which is like a beautiful old cathedral that sits on top of the hill there in Marseille. And what was happening, I went there and the wind was so strong I could literally lean wearing a backpack into the wind and it would support my body weight. That's how strong the wind is. It's really something. So I'd go inside to some of these, there's this beautiful church there and there were little sort of grottos outside, and I made some recordings because they were quite not poorly made, but certainly not robust structures, not stone. So they'd kind of flicker and shudder as the wind kind of fluctuated through there. So I made some recordings there, and when it came time for composing the piece, I not only used that as a kind of texture within it, but I got very interested in trying to explore the physicalness of that wind, the physical experience. So I guess I tried to replicate that through that sort of bass part that opens up that piece. Often for me, it's a kind of duality of relationships that happen with field recordings. They're there in they manifest not only sonically but also as a kind of reference or a compositional reference or guide or suggestion, if you like.
I want to know if there's any pattern to this. Like when you have a field recording and you think it's going to be a good basis for a track and you bring it into your studio, do you think about building a track out of a field recording, or do you think of incorporating a field recording with some ideas you already had, or is it just every composition is completely different in that respect?
They're generally quite different. I mean, for me, I will certainly just have field recordings that I would never add music to or would never kind of inspire pieces of music, I don't think. But I really cherish the quality of the sound that's in those field recordings. But then, I guess with that For Varying Degrees of Winter example of the water, the rain on the water, that became a very strong guide. I wanted to emulate the kind of the subtlety and the texture of that sound. So I tried to recreate it electronically, if you like, using things like EQs, visual EQs, to get a sense of what was happening in that sound. And then for Droplet, it's I guess it's working in both a textual way because it adds a particular kind of sonic element to the piece, but also it's a kind of suggestive guide as to how, the piece might be unfolded. And it's not always that literal that, because it was a loud sound, it will be a loud piece. I mean, often it's that contrast or the fact that there's something else in the field recording that you're hearing or potentially remembering, for me anyway, as I'm listening back to them. And I think that's one of the interesting things about field recordings. Like you said before, for many people in the States and for many people in Australia, for example, we wouldn't have an idea of what that feeling of autumn in America might be like. But we kind of use our imagination. Sound is a very imaginative palette, if you like. When you hear something and you don't know what it is, you tend to use your imagination to fill in the blank. So you personalize it in a way. And I think that's one of the very powerful things about sound, is that it invites the listener to engage with it very strongly and very deeply. And I find certainly with field recordings, that's often the case. And with musique concrète, I guess that, works very strongly with the idea of field recordings, that there is this very deep connection as you watch people listening to a piece of music like that. You can see them beginning to invest, beginning to think, well, I don't know what any of these sounds are, but I'm going to make up my own narrative, or I'm going to, whatever the case might be. And I often have that at concerts. People come up to me at the end and say, that part with the ocean was just incredible. And of course, I've used absolutely no ocean in the recording. But, that's people actually listening and filling in the blanks, and that's really exciting.
As we talked about with getting other people, I don't know if excited is the word, but piquing their interest in sound found in nature, found in the environment, as opposed to purely man-made. Does it simply require playing something for them that you find interesting and they're converted, or is there more of a process here to open up people's ears to found sound?
I guess it really depends. Sometimes there are sounds that are just so curious and natural, I guess, or even though they're coming from the natural world, that it's interesting to listen to them. I have a fantastic recording of bats that I've made at a lovely old abandoned rail tunnel here, and playing that to people is quite amazing, because not only can you hear this very high frequency clicking and popping that they make to understand their environment. They use sound to get a visual image of what's happening around them. You can hear this very high clicking, but you can also hear the sound of the bats flapping and flying past. And that's a really kind of curious thing for people to listen to. And when they hear that, I guess they are instantly excited because they can almost hear the physicalness of the objects in the space. And I think there are other field recordings that I've made that have that similar kind of quality, where people get curious, their interest is piqued. And I think once you have that, then people are very responsive to it. And it's the kind of thing that it's not an instant transformation. People aren't going to suddenly hear, wow, the sound of, some kind of strange monkey in the Amazon jungle, and then that's it. They're just going to listen to monkeys from the Amazon jungle. But there is a kind of, I think there's an awareness that happens, and it's very natural to have that. The whole history of things like birdsong, for example, Oliver Messiaen, the French composer, very inspired by that. And I think, there are probably countless people that sit in their yard in the evening or the morning and listen to birds. I mean, right now, outside I can hear some crows calling, and I just had this beautiful chorus of these amazing birds we have in Australia called magpies, which looks a little bit similar to English magpies, but sound completely different. They have this kind of like cascading, descending tonal sort of song that goes on sometimes for hours, and it's absolutely beautiful. So I think, to have those kinds of sounds around you, you can either choose to engage with it, and sometimes all it takes is that awareness that, it's you can relish those sounds. There's a kind of invitation to do it. And when that happens, I think people are very open to kind of at least being aware of it. It might not change. They might not pay that much more attention to it, but at least at some point of consciousness, they've had that thought, they've had that interest, and they know that there is a stream of work out there that's interested in listening to the natural world and the industrial world as well.
This is the Marketplace of Ideas from Colin Marshall Radio. At colinmarshallradio.com, you will find our complete interview archive, plus other podcasts and much more. My guest is sound artist Lawrence English. We're talking about his new album, A Color for Autumn. It's funny you mentioned the sounds that are going on over there on your end, because it's actually fantastic. I think it's been a great coincidence that we've been talking about environmental sounds, and I can actually hear them too on your end. There's a bit of cars going by sound, a bit of birds as well, and some things I can't even identify. I hope the listener can hear them too, because it's I think it's neat, because not only are we connecting over, one side of the world to the other, we're actually getting the sounds of Australia, which to us Yanks is a very exotic place, believe you me.
Well, I'm actually sure you're probably getting my dog snoring. Because he's lying here on the floor, so I'm pretty sure he'll be contributing to the soundscape, if nothing else.
That's how you can tell that I'm part of a different generation of public radio hosts than before, because anybody over the age of 40 here doing public radio, they would just they would demand that it sound as sterile as possible, but snoring dogs are fine by me.
That's fantastic.
As a matter of fact, I prefer them to be here. Now, to the track Droplet that we talked about and we heard earlier, what else are we hearing in that track? What else did we hear besides the field recording of the wind? Because anybody can tell there are many elements to it, even the untrained ear, but what else is in there?
The main part that you hear up front, apart from that kind of very rich bass tone, is actually a vocal contribution from a fantastic musician from New Zealand called Dean Roberts. And Dean's been a kind of nomad, I guess you'd say. He's travelled, lived in Europe for a long time, lived in New Zealand, visited Australia, lots of different places, been to the States numerous times. And Dean and I had been working on a project, a new solo record for him, which is still in progress and probably will be for some years, I dare say. But we were working on this project, and this vocal loop that had been created by him and another Italian guy called Valerio Tricoli was something that just very naturally made sense in the beginning of this track. It was, I guess, following on from that idea of wind and breath, and it just very naturally matched up with the qualities of the first part of this track. So I layered actually his vocals to create this kind of chorus, this choir of his voice. And for me, it's an interesting departure, because most of my work certainly most of my solo work doesn't involve the voice. And that's not because I'm not interested in voice, it's just because it's the way that it is. I haven't had the opportunity to work with people who I think have the kinds of qualities that would associate with the music that I make. So that was a very big part of it, this kind of idea of bringing him into that equation. And then I guess the way that the track is shaped is, is a very large volume of sound at the beginning that then sort of trickles out. So it's a lot of instrumentation, actually. There's some piano in there, and a lot of analog processing. So I guess in the last probably 3 years, I've been fortunate enough to be in the position to pick up some quite nice outboard equipment, which has become a big part of my interest in transforming sound, is actually through analog and digital processes. But there's a certain quality to, I guess, analog processing that is, I find, quite interesting, because it in some ways it distorts the sound in a way that is very different to the kinds of distortion you might get through using a digital process. And it makes the sound in some ways muted as well, which I think can be quite beautiful, especially when we're talking about this idea of autumn. What struck me almost in every country that I went to, and I traveled through Europe and Japan and here and New Zealand, I've been to lots of countries during autumn, was the fact that it generally did have this softness to it, like a roundness, if you like, rather than, in winter it can be quite crystalline and sharp sounding and sharp looking in a way, because of, the way that ice works and all that kind of thing. With autumn, I found it to be quite the opposite, this very round, nothing too extreme, but still a beautiful kind of richness and density to the environments. And I guess that's something I tried to bring out with the music.
It's funny because I hear the word autumn, and at least in the States, with the autumn we have here, that's a very loaded word musically. I don't know if that's something you've run across, but autumnal is a word that is often used here to simply describe a certain musical feeling, and it's often associated with kind of the wistful 60s folk songs and things like that. To what degree did you think that your new album, A Color for Autumn, gets across the fact that it gets across the variance of autumns wherever you're going?
I mean, it's true. This idea of autumn it is a kind of loaded term in a sense. And I think in different ways it has these ideas of maybe the bucolic quality, or that kind of pastoralness, maybe, I think is another kind of term that's in the same kind of realm. But for me, I guess I was trying to find, I didn't think about the word, that's for sure. In fact, the title for the record didn't come till quite late. I mean, it was certainly, I knew it was the second one in this series, and I guess there's a certain choice in using the word for the season in each title, and that may not be the case for the other two, which obviously will be summer and spring as they come to hand. I mean, it made sense. The 4 Varying Degrees of Winter record really was this idea of 4 varying degrees of winter, which was a bit of a pun, I guess, in terms of the temperature, but also the kind of state of winter as you find it. And I guess the idea of A Color for Autumn as a title was partly to do with the fact that, obviously there is that transitional colour change in a lot of autumns across the world. But also, I wasn't trying to necessarily directly emulate, but potentially give an impression of. It's that sort of impressionist Monet style of or if you like, ukiyo, the Japanese wood block printing, where you have a whole bunch of ink and colour and you press it onto the page, and what's left is an impression of that woodblock print. And I think it's a similar kind of idea for this record. I've got these field recordings and ideas and photographs and various other things that I'm pressing through this filter, if you like. And what comes out on the CD is an impression or a colour of what that autumn may have been, if you know what I mean.
Would it be accurate to say when you're doing an album like this, the concept for the album isn't really something that you 100% go in with? It's the concept, in a sense, emerges from what you've completed.
It's interesting. I think for me with these 4, I am trying to be very conscious of the concept. With other records, it's definitely more variable. But with these ones, I'm trying to use materials that I've recorded during those situations where I've been to autumn. And often, I travel probably 2 or 3 times a year for quite long periods. So I try to keep in mind that I need to cultivate those memories and ideas and experiences to contribute to these records. So, for example, with the Color for Autumn record, I mean, it really was almost 2 years worth of traveling that contributed to the experience of making it. And with the For Varying Degrees of Winter, it was the same kind of period. So these records don't allow themselves to happen very quickly. So for me, I do have to keep that in mind. At the moment, I'm thinking, obviously, if we're working back through the seasons, summer is next. And, I don't travel very often in the European, American, Japanese summer. So this year, I think I'm going to try to go to Japan in high summer, specifically with that in mind. And ideally, at some point, go to Europe in summer and have a nice holiday, maybe, or the States, in fact. But I have to kind of make those opportunities. Whereas, in the Southern Hemisphere, I've been through summers in Australia and Africa and Brazil and New Zealand. In fact, all the continents on the Southern Hemisphere, I've experienced that idea of summer. But to get that sense of what the Northern summer is like is going to take a little bit of time. So I need to try and find opportunities to make that happen. I've fortunately had summer in China, for example, so I can call on that, and some fantastic recordings from summer in China. But to actually get those other senses of what summer is like, is going to take some time. So each of these records sort of unfolds in a very calculated way, if you like. But then for other records, for instance, the album I made last year for the UK label Touch, Kuri no Oto, which means the sound of fog or the sound of mist, that was very much to do with a number of very discrete memories that kind of informed an idea of what the record would be. And that took on, as the record kind of developed, it did take on a lot more meaning, I guess. And by the time it came to the process of naming the record, it was very clear that those initial memories and ideas that I had became the basis for the record, and I guess they told the story.
When you're creating a recording like that one or like this new one, how much is it a process of translating general sense impressions, and I mean all senses, into sound, and kind of narrowing of all the senses, all sense memories into one dimension?
I find that process quite important in a way, or certainly present. I would definitely describe it as something that's very present in the way that I work. I mean, I tend to feel that most music is a kind of impression of memory, and I guess for me, what I try to do is, rather than with songwriting, for example, if you're telling stories about yourself, there's a particular narrative structure that's implicated in the way that people then interpret what you've written. And of course, people bring their own emotions and experiences to your stories. But with something like sound, where there is no formal narrative, if you like, I think it can be quite powerful to play with that idea of memory. Like I was saying before, I guess, when I sit down and listen to A Colourful Autumn, each of the pieces reflects on a different place and time and people that I met, food that I ate. I mean, that's one of the great things about travel, is you can experience all this wonderful food, wonderful company, wonderful environments. And each one of those is a kind of reflection or inspiration from, or some kind of relationship to a direct part of something that's happened in my life. But ideally for other people, for example, they take this record and it makes the cut and gets onto someone's iPod. They are traveling somewhere in another country, or they're traveling to and from work. The songs, if they listen to them a few times, begin to take on their own memory, their own things that happen. And I think that's what's so wonderful about music and quite magical about it, is the fact that we all have these songs and bands and musical experiences at certain points in our life that are so powerful and meaningful and connect us to something. And I think that's partly because of what I was talking about before, that idea that music isn't necessarily always literal. It allows or invites the listener to contribute something of themselves, whether that be to the understanding of the lyrics, or whether it be to the kinds of sounds that they hear and what they imagine and what they experience while they're listening to the music. All those things kind of culminate together to give you a particular relationship with sound that I think is really powerful. And, it's like that thing where you'll hear a song from 15 years ago, and I just had this experience recently. I was making artwork for an exhibition, and it was an artwork using magnetic tape, so I went back through a lot of tapes to tape over these cassettes, because it's difficult to get cassettes here in Australia right now. And I was listening back to a couple of them, and I could remember the lyrics from these songs that I hadn't listened to since I was about 12. And I think there's an amazing connection there. I thought, if only I could remember the periodic table in the same way, or, my maths times table. It'd be fantastic. I could be a mathematician if I could sing my way out of problems. And I think that's a really interesting thing. It's like often, often people describe smell as a very direct sense as well. You walk past someone, they're wearing a perfume that reminds you of someone you met when you were 10, or there are certain kinds of things that trigger that memory. And I think sound and music is really one of those elements that stimulates the mind in a way that potentially looking at a photo doesn't do. So I think that's something I try to be very conscious of and aware of, that people are going to hear this and they're going to interpret it in their own way. But I try to keep in mind that I want it to be open, that I want people to be able to have the chance. Don't be too direct with the sounds that you use, be suggestive, I guess, rather than heavy-handed with the way that the music kind of unfolds.
This brings back to mind that fan you mentioned who came up to you after the live show and said, "I love that ocean in the background," or "I love the ocean in the foreground of that piece," and of course there was no ocean. It must be a lot of fun to compare notes with listeners about your own music and see what it invokes for them, because it's probably fairly different most of the time.
It is, and that's the beauty of the work, is that, and the beauty of all the work in this field, I think, is that everyone brings their own imagination to it, and you have these very disparate understandings of what people are actually hearing, and I find that quite reassuring in a way, that everyone is using their mind while they listen, if you like. They're putting on the record, or they're at the concert, and they're engaged enough to actually go somewhere. And that's really, for me, when I listen to music, what I want to happen is I want to be taken somewhere. I want to try and actually have this experience that's something resonating within me, something deeper than just putting on audio wallpaper, if you like. I really want to be transported. And I'd like to think that, some, if not all, of the music that I create has that quality for listeners.
Some musicians in this genre will talk about their music as creating an environment for the listener, but you're less about that than about creating something that they can actually feel as if they're not doing, but, as you said, experiencing versus just existing within.
Yeah. I mean, I think certainly that reference of the environment is part of it, and maybe that's, I guess it depends how you choose to listen to a record. I guess if you put it on, it plays in another room and you're doing something else, then maybe it does just contribute like a tint, that idea of, I guess, initially what ambient music was about, if we're talking about in terms of Brian Eno's notions of ambient. It did act as a tint and environmental color, if you like, which I think is a really beautiful way for some music to work. But I guess the interesting thing about Brian Eno is a great example. You can put those music for airports and on land and those recordings on and listen to them in another room, and they form a fantastic kind of audio color for the space that you're in. But then if you actually sit down and listen to them, they're incredibly detailed and intricate. And I think that's a curious dichotomy for composers to work with. And it's a challenge, I guess, to make something that is engaging when it needs to be deeply engaging, but also is, I guess, open enough that it can be played and suit multiple situations. And that's certainly a very big challenge. Some music just simply can't do that. It's too intense. It's too powerful and dramatic. And I think in terms of this idea of being dramatic, that's something that isn't necessarily so strong in A Colourful Autumn. I think there are certain musical changes. For example, the horn sections that are in some of the pieces, I find personally to be probably the more dramatic or direct musical cues on the record. They're not too dramatic as to kind of like break concentration. I think if you were in there and that happens, it feels very natural. But if you were putting it on the background, it's not going to suddenly make you, oh, hang on a minute, there's been a huge change, I've got to listen to this part. It's just, it can still be open.
Speaking of, let's go back to the album and hear one more track from it. From A Colourful Autumn by Lawrence English, here is The Surface of Everything. That was The Surface of Everything from Lawrence English's new album, A Color for Autumn. Now, that's another collaborative piece. What was the situation there?
It's a piece that has some beautiful electronics on it from a friend of mine in Vienna called Christian Fenez. And Fenez, I guess, has had some incredible music over the last 15 years, I'd say now. The Endless Summer record, ironically, another record to do with summer. So I won't be calling my summer record Endless Summer, that's for sure. Which I guess is just as well, because the Beach Boys also had the classic Endless Summer record. And I love the Beach Boys as well. Basically, we were invited to work on a project together, which was called the 60 Project. It was 60 sound artists from all across the world celebrating the 60th anniversary of Musique Concrète and Pierre Schaeffer's work. A composer in England invited a whole bunch of sound artists to create a work and then to process that, and then he sort of mixed it together, if you like, into a kind of concrete composition. And Christian supplied some sounds to that project, and I actually processed some of his sounds. And from that, I basically messed around with some of those, and I said to him, look, I think this is really working in this piece. Would you mind if I use those pieces in this composition? And we went back and forth a little bit, and I played in the material, and he was very happy with the way that it kind of fitted into the work, and it kind of went from there. So it was a very organic kind of collaboration, something that was very instantaneous and almost, I guess, a bit like the Dean Roberts situation, where this material was there and it kind of, in some ways, fueled the way that the composition developed, so it became a kind of integral part of it. Often with collaboration, that's one of the really enjoyable things about it, is there are these kinds of happy accidents almost in a lot of cases, where you'll kind of come across something and it makes a whole lot of sense suddenly, and the piece goes in a different direction that it otherwise would not have gone in. And I think that's a great quality of collaboration, and something that I ideally look for when I'm working with other people, is that chance to go somewhere that, as a solo producer, you may not get to.
What would you call the texture that emerges on the piece, The Surface of Everything, from that collaboration? What sound art is so often concerned with emergence and what emerges from parts that aren't necessarily totally coordinated. What came out of that? Those gears?
Yeah, I guess. I mean, the way that I think about what Christian contributed was, it's really electronics. For me, it is this idea of an additional texture and a kind of detail, if you like. I think there is a lot of detail in the sound that he creates generally, and that's one of the things that I really like about his compositional work. Not only does he have these very sweeping, chordal, melodic phrases in his work, but he also has this amazing sense of like electronic detail and these very focused kinds of sounds that are quite beautiful and engaging. And if you're listening to it on a home stereo, it's one experience, but then if you happen to put headphones on, you're suddenly invited into this whole other world. And I find that is a really kind of beautiful quality of the work that he does. And I think those particular sounds that he created for that piece, they have that quality, they have that detail and that richness and the kind of dynamic variation that's such a trademark of what he does.
Now, anybody who reads even just the bio on your website or hears this conversation will realize you have a number of roles. Of course, you are a solo artist, and as we've talked about, you collaborate, and also, as we said at the top of the show, you run a label, you curate. This balance of creator, collaborator, and curator, is this a tough balance to strike, or is it just kind of what's natural for you to do?
I mean, look, I think it's always a challenge in everyone's life to find time for the things that they love doing, and I love doing all those things. Being in Australia, I think I'm in a particular position. Australia is a long way away from the rest of the world to some degree. I mean, we can sit and talk in real time, and that's fantastic. But if I was to come visit you, it would take me about 14 or 15 hours from when I got to the airport. And to get to Europe, it's basically 26, 27, 28 hours. So it's quite a way away. So I think the idea of curation and what Room 40 has become, not just as a label publishing audio, but also curating exhibitions and putting on festivals and touring musicians to Australia and New Zealand and Japan, all these kinds of things, they are, I guess, integral if we're going to keep growing things in Australia. And I'm a very big believer in, I guess, opening up ears and making audiences for this work, because traditionally in Australia, during the 1990s, for example, the number of experimental, if you like, musicians that came to Australia, you could really count on two hands or three hands. There were some, amazing concerts, but they were so few and far between, certainly where I was living in Brisbane. And since that time, since about 2001, we've had upwards of, 12, 15 people coming every single year. And it's been fantastic because we've seen these connections between local musicians and artists developing with internationals. I mean, just recently, a friend of mine from Brisbane went on tour in Japan, and a lot of the contacts he's made for that tour were off the back of some collaborations that we did last year with him and another musician from Japan. So there are all these kinds of connections that happen, and I'm a big believer in this idea of community, I guess, to a degree, where all of us are interested in the same kinds of things. We want to present work, and we want to excite people about sound. So it's important that there are people making those opportunities. And without people in every country kind of pushing and interested to present new work and to engage ears, it's just not going to grow. And I think that's kind of one of the big challenges, and certainly in countries like here, and I guess in other countries. For instance, I'm planning to go to Greece at the end of the year for a while. And there's such a small scene there, but the people that are behind it are so passionate that they really want to get other people excited about what's happening with the work. And I think that's really something that interests me. It's the same with going to China. I've been to China for a number of tours, and each time I go, you get this sense that people are hungry and they're interested and they want to engage with work. And I find that really inspiring, that there is, these young cultures out there, and to some degree, I guess Australia falls into that category, young cultures where they're producing quite interesting individual work, which is informed by all the other kinds of things that feed into that, geographically feed into that community, but also have this kind of international connectivity. And that's something I think is more and more important, to kind of make those connections. I mean, at the very root of it, we have the same interests, and we want to kind of share that.
When you go from place to place and you compare the communities in various countries, do you notice that there's any difference, not simply in size, but in sensibility, as far as the Australian scene for the kind of sound art you do versus the rest of the world?
I think there are definitely particular qualities that certain kinds of places tend to have. For example, I think, somewhere like Europe, if you look at European improvised music, there's such a history there with that kind of work that people, I guess, are informed by that. And there's a kind of quality to the playing that goes on. In the same way that a couple of years ago there was what was, I guess, someone else termed the onkyo scene in Japan, this very kind of minimal music, people using sine wave generators and small sounds, very intimate, which was in some way and the antithesis of what was happening in the rest of Tokyo. You'd go to galleries like Offsite and hear this very quiet, intimate, minuscule music, and then you go outside and be bombarded with all this kind of like signage and people yelling and advertising, which I think is an interesting kind of counterpoint. And it's interesting, you look at somewhere like China. China has a very robust scene, but a lot of it is based around noise and noise music in the experimental stuff. There's not that much ambient, for example, music coming out of China, which I think is a telling indicator of how those peoples are beginning to engage with sound, and how they're kind of emulating or transforming the experiences that they have and the interests that they have. So I think that you do see those very individual qualities coming through. And at the same time, there is a kind of generic quality sometimes to music, but that tends to be because the artist is either just not quite, they haven't quite found what they're doing yet, or that they're interested in following those trends and particular kinds of musical events. Some people want to create minimal techno, and it sounds the same in China as it does in Detroit, and that's great. It's great that there's that kind of general interest in it. But then sometimes you go somewhere and you discover it's like in parts of Africa, something like some of those Congolese bands, Continent Number One, they've totally developed this sound that's completely their own. It couldn't exist anywhere else in the world. And I think that's exciting when you come across those things.
Now, we're coming up toward the end of our time, and I feel like we've only scratched the surface, but I want to ask you one more thing. It's that, what do you think is important to get across to audiences that you suspect are receptive or would be receptive to the kind of sound art you do, but maybe don't have a lot of experience with it? What message is it important to send to them, to bring them in, to get them in the gateway?
Just have a listen. I think that's the simplest message. I mean, be open. It's like you never know when you're going to see, watch a TV program you're going to like. You don't know when you're going to come across a painting that you end up loving. You never know when you're going to hear a sound that is going to make you rethink how it is that you engage with your ears.
I think those are words of wisdom indeed. The new album, once again, is A Color for Autumn. Lawrence, thanks so much for taking the time to come on the program.
My pleasure, Colin. Thanks for having me.
This has been the Marketplace of Ideas from Colin Marshall Radio. Find our complete interview archive at colinmarshallradio.com, as well as our other podcasts and more. Our theme music is produced by Ben Althouse. Check out more of his work at benalthouse.com. Thank you for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.